Now we have the client ID and client secret token in our hand, which we got during the registration of the client application with the GitHub OAuth2 server. Now let's try to understand what are the changes that we have to make inside any Spring application or Spring Boot application if you want to use Spring Security Framework to leverage OAuth2 framework during the login of the application. So for the same, first we have to add this dependency inside pom.xml. Since in this application I'm just going to consume the auth server which is built outside my application, I have to use only OAuth2 client. But if you have a scenario where you want to build the auth server by yourself, you can also import the dependency which is related to OAuth2 auth server. But now you can see we imported only OAuth2 client, which is good enough in our scenario. And other than that, we should also import other basic dependencies like Spring Boot Starter Security and Spring Boot Starter Web. So these dependencies will add all the required libraries that we need inside our Spring application. And you can see this is the Spring Boot application, and we have this is the main class with the name Spring Security OAuth GitHub. I also have project configuration in order to use Spring Security. I'll come to this class again. Before that, in my project, I have only a single REST controller with the path / like if you can remember inside GitHub registration, we have given the redirect URL as localhost 8080. So whenever that redirection happen, the request will come here, and I made this path is secured inside my configurations. Once authentication is successful, I'll be redirected to secure.html, and secure.html simply displays successfully login using GitHub. You can assume this secure.html is a protected resource staying inside my server, but if someone want to use this protected resource, they have to complete the login into my application using the GitHub OAuth2. And at the same time, after successful login, for our reference purpose, I'm also printing all the details that we are getting from the GitHub as well, like my name, my email, my repository details. All those details will be getting from the GitHub OAuth2 server. Though I'm not using them here for our reference, I'm just printing it. If you go and check the configuration class, you can see this is the Spring Security configuration class, and we are overriding a configure method, and all this http.authorize_request. I'm saying any request inside this application has to be authenticated. In this scenario, I have only one REST controller, which is secure controller, and it has to be authenticated. And the login type that I want to use is the OAuth2 login. Like we have different type of logins like HTTP basic, form login, and OAuth2 login is the other type of login that we are indicating inside our application, saying that I'm going to leverage the OAuth2 framework. Due to that, we are mentioning OAuth2 login here. So whenever we add this OAuth2 login here, it will add a filter inside our security flow, which is OAuth2 login authentication filter. Now we made configurations inside configure method to indicate that our secure controller is a secured service and everyone has to be authenticated using OAuth2 login. Now the next step is, for our OAuth2, there are different components involved: user, client, auth server, and resource server. So in this scenario, the resource server is this application itself, and the resource is the secure.html. And the user or resource owner is me. Whenever I try to access this secure.html, I'll be asked to use my GitHub credentials to prove my identity by redirecting to the GitHub URL. And obviously, client, we have to register inside our application so that the client ID, client secret will be sent to the auth server by this application. Once we register the client, we should also tell to our application which auth server I'm using, whether it's a GitHub or Google or any other auth server. So we have to provide those auth server endpoint details, all those details as well. For the same, first we have to register the client details inside this application so that the client ID and client secret will be leveraged by the application whenever it is interacting with the auth server. So there are three different ways on how we can register the client details. The very first and long approach is this one, whatever you see the commented code here. I just uncommented for your reference. You have to write a method with the name client registration, and there is a client registration class available inside the Spring Security Framework. In this client registration class, you have to pass the registration ID. So registration ID is something which indicates which companies or which organization authorization server that I am going to use. So in this scenario, since I am going to use the GitHub Auth server, I'm just mentioning registration ID as GitHub, and client ID is the value that we get during our registration, and client secret also we get during our registration. Scope, like what are the scopes that we want to use, like whether it's a read or write, and what is the authorization URL, what is the endpoint of the auth server belongs to GitHub, and what is the token URI, like to get the access token, and user info URI to get the details of the user, and what is the client name that we have given for our client application inside a GitHub website, and what are the authorization grant type that we want to use. And you can see here this authorization grant type has 5 different type of grant types. One is authorization code, implicit, refresh, client credentials, and password, which is same as resource owner password credentials. And as we discussed, implicit is the one which is getting deprecated, so don't use that. We should always use any of the other 4. And redirect URL also we can mention. But you can see here there is a lot of configuration involved with this first approach. So due to this reason, most of the folks, they don't use this, but this approach is useful whenever you are building the auth server inside your organization only. But if you have a scenario where you're using the most common auth servers available in the industry like GitHub, Google, Facebook, then there is a simple approach where you just have to create a method client registration and leverage the common OAUTH2 provider. So this is the common OAUTH2 provider is the class which is provided by the Spring Security Framework team itself by considering the most common OAUTH2 servers that we are going to use. You can see here for Google, they put all the configuration details, what is the token URL, what is the authorization URL, everything, even for GitHub, Facebook, and Okta. So since all these details are available inside the framework, you don't have to take that pain of configuring again. So you just mention what is the auth server that you are going to use, like GitHub or Google, and you call get builder with the registration ID as GitHub, and client ID you will pass what are the value that we receive along with the client secret, and eventually you will call the build method. So this will return a client registration. Once we have this client registration values available, you should also create a client registration repository. Client registration repository is same as our user detail service that we discussed previously in normal authentication flow. In the same way, in OAuth2 flow, we have a client registration repository which have a method find by registration ID. So this method will use the registration ID to get the client registration details that we configure. Like I configured GitHub, I configured Google. So based upon the registration ID at the runtime, it will get the client registration details by leveraging the values that we configured inside this method. And again, client registration repository, we can go with in-memory client registration repository or JDBC client registration repository. But now I'm using here in-memory client registration repository. For that, you have to pass the client registration previously you configured here. So since I'm keeping the @bin, so my framework is smart enough to detect, okay, I have a client registration repository. I have to use this with the in-memory client registration repository along with the configurations provided by the user under the method client registration. So again, this is also another second approach. But if you have a scenario where I don't want to take all this pain and I want my client registration and client registration repository to be auto configured by the Spring Boot, you can still simply go to the application.properties and mention these two values. So here you are indicating that you are going to use GitHub, and this is the client ID and client secret. So whenever you mention these properties inside your application.properties, your Spring Boot is smart enough to create a client registration based upon this client ID and client secret, and it also create a bin client registration repository for you. But again, this is only for GitHub. But if you have a Facebook, you just replace the GitHub value with the Facebook or Google in this location. You can also have a lot of properties that you can configure inside application.properties, which you can always identify and use them by going through the Spring Security documentation. So I'll just show you there. We can go to the Spring Security documentation website. So this is the URL, like Spring Security. I'm just seeing the docs of 5.2.x and OAuth2 docs I'm looking. So you can see here, if you scroll down, so these are all the properties that we can use in order to register our OAuth2 details inside the property file itself. You don't have to manually create the client registration and client registration repository, but you can always leverage all these properties. So now we have done enough configurations inside our application. In the next lecture, let's try to start our application and see how our configurations to OAuth2 is working by logging into the application. Thank you and see you in the next video. Bye.